The day Sharon Whitmore from the HOA threatened to fine me $200 for keeping a portable heater at my mailbox was the day I realized I had moved into a neighborhood ruled by absolute lunatics. I had just finished setting up the little electric heater in the small weather shelter I had built next to our cluster mailbox when Sharon's white Lexus pulled up beside me. It was early January in Duluth, Minnesota, where the temperature regularly dropped below zero, and standing at the mailbox for more than 30 seconds felt like your face was being sandblasted with frozen needles. The cluster mailbox for our subdivision was positioned at the far end of the street, roughly a quarter-mile from my house, and checking mail in the dead of winter was genuinely miserable. "Excuse me," Sharon called out, rolling down her window just enough to speak through the gap. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I looked up from plugging the extension cord into the small outlet I had installed in my weather shelter. The shelter itself was nothing fancy, just a simple three-sided wooden structure with a small bench and a roof, designed to provide minimal protection from the wind while residents sorted through their mail. I had built it with my own money and materials, and several neighbors had already thanked me for it. "Just setting up a little heater," I said, keeping my tone friendly. "It gets pretty cold out here, as I am sure you have noticed." Sharon's lips pressed into a thin line. She was probably in her late 40s, with that specific haircut that seemed to be standard issue for HOA board members everywhere. Short, blonde, and aggressively styled. The HOA bylaws clearly state that no permanent structures or modifications can be made to common areas without board approval. "I got approval," I said, pulling out my phone. "I submitted the request for the shelter 2 months ago. Brenda Patterson approved it." "Brenda is no longer on the board," Sharon said, her voice clipping each word with precision. "And even if the shelter was approved, which I will need to verify, there is certainly no provision for electrical installations or heating devices." The wind picked up, and I pulled my coat tighter around myself. "Sharon, it is literally 5 degrees outside. This heater is just meant to make it comfortable enough for people to sort their mail without getting frostbite. It is not hurting anyone." "It is a liability issue," she said. "What if someone gets burned? What if it causes a fire? What if the electrical load is too much for the outlet?" I stared at her. "It is a 1,500-watt heater plugged into a properly installed outdoor outlet that is rated for 3,000 watts. I am a licensed electrician, Sharon. This is literally what I do for a living." "Then you should know better than to install something without proper permits and HOA approval," she snapped. "I am issuing you a formal warning. Remove the heater immediately, or you will receive a $200 fine by the end of the week." She rolled up her window before I could respond and drove away, leaving me standing in the bitter cold with my perfectly safe, perfectly reasonable portable heater still plugged in beside me. I am Isaac Quinlan, and I have lived in the Meadowbrook Hills subdivision for exactly 7 months. My wife Nina and I had moved here from Minneapolis after I got a promotion at my electrical contracting company. The house was perfect. 4 bedrooms, a big yard for our 2 dogs, and a supposedly quiet neighborhood with good schools for when we eventually had kids. The HOA had seemed like a minor inconvenience during the buying process, something we would barely notice. That assumption had been catastrophically wrong. I called Nina as I walked back to the house, the heater still running in the shelter behind me. She answered on the second ring. "Let me guess," she said. "Sharon, how did you know?" "Because Denise just texted me that she saw Sharon's car parked at the mailbox cluster and figured she was harassing you." Nina sighed. Denise Rogers was our next-door neighbor and had become a good friend over the past few months. "What did she want this time?" She wants me to remove the heater, says it is a liability. The heater you just installed this morning, the very same. Nina was quiet for a moment. You know what? Do not remove it. Let her fine us. We will fight it. I loved my wife. You sure? $200 is not nothing. Isaac, you built that shelter with your own money to help the entire neighborhood. You installed that outlet safely and legally. If Sharon wants to be ridiculous about a heater that keeps people from freezing while they get their mail, then we will take it to the full HOA board meeting. She was right, of course. I left the heater running. The fine notice arrived 3 days later, tucked into a crisp white envelope with the HOA letterhead. It was everything Sharon had threatened: $200 for unauthorized electrical installation in common area, and failure to comply with verbal directive from HOA board member. The notice gave me 10 days to pay or face additional penalties, including potential legal action. I took a photo of the notice and sent it to Nina along with a message. Still want to fight this? Her response was immediate. Absolutely. I already emailed the board requesting time at next month's meeting. The next morning, I went to get the mail and found the heater unplugged, with a laminated sign zip tied to the cord. Use of this device is strictly prohibited by order of the HOA board. I stood there in the -10-degree weather, my breath forming clouds of ice crystals, and made a decision. If Sharon wanted to be petty about a heater, I could be petty right back. That afternoon, I went to the Army surplus store in downtown Duluth and bought the most ridiculous cold weather gear I could find. I am talking full Arctic expedition level equipment. A massive orange Parka rated for -50 degrees, snow pants, insulated boots, a fur-lined trapper hat with ear flaps, ski goggles, and thick mittens that made my hands look like catcher's mitts. The entire outfit made me look like I was preparing to summit Everest, not check my mail in a Minnesota suburb. The first time I wore the outfit to the mailbox, it was around 4 in the afternoon, peak time for mail retrieval when most people got home from work. I waddled down the street in my absurd getup, looking like an orange marshmallow man, and made a very big production of checking my mail. Several neighbors stared. A few laughed. Denise gave me an enthusiastic thumbs up from her driveway. I did this every single day. Rain or shine, warm or cold, I would suit up in my ridiculous Arctic gear and march down to the mailbox. When the temperature rose to a balmy 35 degrees, I still wore the full outfit, sweating profusely inside the parka, but committed to making my point. Within a week, my little protest had become the talk of the neighborhood. People would time their mail runs to coincide with mine just to see the spectacle. Kids thought it was hilarious. Most adults found it somewhere between amusing and inspiring, a small act of rebellion against Sharon's increasingly authoritarian HOA rule. Sharon, predictably, was furious. She showed up at my house on a Tuesday evening, accompanied by 2 other HOA board members I had never met. Nina answered the door while I was still in the kitchen making dinner. "We need to speak with your husband," Sharon said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. Nina called me over, and I appeared still wearing my apron that said Grill Sergeant, which my brother had given me as a joke Christmas gift. "Isaac, this is ridiculous," Sharon said without preamble. "Your little stunt at the mailbox is making our entire neighborhood look foolish." "My stunt?" I said mildly. "I am just getting my mail, dressed appropriately for the weather, I might add. You look like a traffic cone," one of the other board members said. Her name was Patricia something, I recalled from the HOA directory. "A warm traffic cone," I corrected. "Unlike everyone else who has to stand out there freezing because someone decided a portable heater was too dangerous." Sharon's face was turning an interesting shade of red. That heater was a safety hazard. It was a OL-listed appliance properly installed by a licensed electrician, I said. The only hazard here is people getting frostbite because you are on a power trip. Excuse me. Nina put a hand on my arm, a gentle warning, but I was done being diplomatic. Sharon, in the 7 months I have lived here, you have sent me violations for my grass being a quarter-inch too tall, for leaving my garbage cans visible from the street for 2 hours past pickup time, for having the wrong shade of white trim on my garage door, and for parking my work truck in my own driveway overnight. You have made living in this neighborhood a constant source of stress over the most trivial, absurd rules I have ever encountered. So yes, I will wear a stupid parka to get my mail if that is what it takes to highlight how unreasonable you are being about a heater that was helping everyone. The third board member, a tired-looking man in his 60s, actually nodded slightly, though he tried to hide it. Sharon's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. You need to be very careful, Mr. Quinlan. The board has the authority to place a lien on your property for unpaid fines. We can make your life very difficult. Is that a threat? Nina asked, her voice sharp. It is a statement of fact, Sharon said. The rules exist for a reason and everyone needs to follow them, including you. They left, and Nina closed the door perhaps a bit harder than necessary. She is going to escalate this, Nina said. Let her, I replied, though I felt a knot of worry forming in my stomach. We had bought this house with a significant mortgage, and while we were financially stable, the threat of property liens was not something to take lightly. The next day, I received another notice from the HOA. This one informed me that my mailbox shelter was being deemed a code violation after all, as the original approval had been improperly granted by the previous board member. I had 30 days to remove it or face fines of $50 per day. I called Brenda Patterson, the former board member who had approved my shelter. She was a pleasant woman in her 70s who had resigned from the board after her husband's health issues required more of her attention. Isaac, I am so sorry, she said when I explained the situation. Sharon has been gunning for you ever since you questioned her about the fence height restrictions at that meeting back in October. I remembered that meeting. A neighbor had wanted to install a 6-foot privacy fence, and Sharon had insisted the rules only allowed 5 feet. I had pointed out that the actual bylaw said no more than 6 feet, which Sharon had claimed was a typo. It had been a whole thing. Is there anything I can do? I asked Brenda. Document everything, she said. Every interaction, every notice, every fine. Sharon has been running the board like her personal fiefdom ever since she became president last year. There are a lot of unhappy people in the neighborhood, but everyone is too afraid of retaliation to speak up. What kind of retaliation? Brenda hesitated. The Johnsons on Maple Street wanted to install solar panels. Sharon buried them in violation notices until they gave up. The Chens tried to paint their front door red, which is actually allowed under the rules, but Sharon claimed it was too bright and threatened daily fines until they repainted it brown. She plays favorites too. Her friend Margaret has a shed that is clearly over the size limit, but Sharon has never said a word about it. This was worse than I thought. Has anyone reported her to the state HOA regulatory board? Minnesota does not have much in the way of HOA oversight, Brenda said. And technically, Sharon is not breaking any laws. She is just interpreting the rules in the most restrictive possible way and applying them selectively. We talked for a few more minutes, and Brenda promised to send me copies of all the documentation she still had from her time on the board, including the original approval for my shelter. That evening, Nina and I sat down with a bottle of wine and read through the HOA bylaws cover to cover. They were 73 pages of dense legalese, covering everything from acceptable window treatments to the precise angle at which holiday decorations could be mounted. But buried in Section 12, subsection 4, we found something interesting. Any homeowner could petition for a special vote to recall a board member with signatures from 30% of the neighborhood households. There are 82 houses in Meadowbrook Hills, Nina said, doing the math. We would need 25 signatures. Think we can get them? Nina smiled. Oh, I know we can. I have been in the neighborhood Facebook group. People are fed up. We decided to be strategic. First, I kept up my Parka routine, making sure everyone was constantly reminded of why I was doing it. Second, Nina started quietly reaching out to neighbors who had been on the receiving end of Sharon's overzealous enforcement. Third, we documented everything Sharon did, building a case that she was abusing her authority. The Parka protests continued to be a hit. Someone made a meme of me waddling to the mailbox and posted it in the neighborhood group with the caption, "Peak, Meadowbrook Hills Energy." Another neighbor started wearing a comically oversized winter coat in solidarity, even though his mailbox was attached to his house and he did not actually need to go anywhere to get his mail. Sharon responded by having the HOA lawyer send me a cease and desist letter, claiming I was creating a public nuisance and bringing negative attention to the community. The letter was so absurd that I posted it on the neighborhood Facebook page, and the reaction was swift and overwhelmingly in my favor. People started sharing their own stories of Sharon's petty enforcement actions. The tide was turning. Then things got serious. I came home from work one evening in late January to find Sharon's car in my driveway along with a white truck I did not recognize. Nina met me at the door and she was angry. "They are trying to remove your shelter," she said. "Sharon brought a contractor." I walked around to the side of the house where I could see the mailbox area. Sure enough, 2 men in work clothes were examining my shelter while Sharon stood nearby with a clipboard. I walked down there quickly, Nina following behind me. "What is going on?" I called out. Sharon turned, her expression smug. "The 30-day grace period ended yesterday. Since you failed to remove the structure, the HOA is exercising its right to remedy the violation and bill you for the cost." "That notice was dated January 6th, I said. "Today is February 2nd. "That is 27 days, not 30. Sharon's smile did not waver. "The notice clearly states that weekends and holidays are not counted in the grace period. That brings us to 30 business days." I stared at her. "That is not how any of this works." "The notice does not say anything about business days. It is implied in the standard HOA enforcement procedures," she said. One of the contractors looked uncomfortable. "Madam, if there is a dispute about the timeline, maybe we should hold off." "There is no dispute," Sharon said firmly. "The homeowner is in violation. Remove the structure." "Do not touch it," I said, my voice hard. "This structure was legally approved. I have documentation. If you remove it, that is destruction of personal property and I will call the police." Sharon laughed. "It is on HOA common property. You have no rights to it." "Actually," Nina said, pulling out her phone, "I spoke with a property lawyer this morning. The area where Isaac built the shelter is technically not common property. It is within the easement zone, which according to county records, is the responsibility of the individual homeowners whose property borders it. Since the shelter is adjacent to our property line, Isaac had every right to build it." I looked at Nina in surprise. She had not mentioned calling a lawyer. Sharon's smile faltered. "That is not what the HOA survey shows." "Then the HOA survey is wrong," Nina said calmly. "I have the county assessor's maps right here. Would you like to see them?" The contractors were definitely backing away now, sensing legal trouble. Sharon's face had gone from smug to furious. "This is not over," she hissed. "You want to play games? Fine. But you are going to regret making an enemy of me." She left, the contractors following quickly behind her. Nina and I stood in the cold watching them go. "Since when did you call a property lawyer?" I asked. "This morning after you left for work. I figured Sharon would try something like this." She grinned. "Turns out I was right." I pulled her into a hug. "You are amazing, I know." But Sharon's parting words stayed with me. She was going to escalate, and I had no idea how far she would go. The answer came 2 weeks later, when I received a notice from the Duluth Code Enforcement Office. Someone had reported that I was running an unlicensed electrical business out of my home in violation of residential zoning laws. The notice required me to appear for a hearing and potentially face fines of up to $5,000. I was livid. I did not run my business from home. I had a proper office and shop in the commercial district downtown. Yes, I kept some tools and supplies in my garage, and occasionally I did paperwork from my home office, but that was not the same as operating a business from a residential property. The complaint had been filed anonymously, but I knew exactly who was behind it. Nina was even angrier than I was. "She is making false reports to government agencies now. That has to be illegal." "Probably not," I said grimly. "Anyone can file a complaint. Even if it is baseless, I still have to deal with it." The hearing was scheduled for March 15th, which gave me a month to prepare. I gathered all my business documentation, licensing information, lease agreement for my commercial space, everything to prove that I was operating legally and that my home was just a home. Meanwhile, the recall petition was gaining momentum. Nina had been working with several other fed-up neighbors, and they had collected 18 signatures so far. We needed 7 more to trigger the recall vote. The neighborhood Facebook group had become a battleground. Sharon's supporters, mostly her personal friends and people who benefited from her selective enforcement, argued that the HOA rules existed for a reason, and that property values would decline if we let people do whatever they wanted. My supporters, which was the majority, pointed out that enforcing reasonable community standards was different from petty tyranny. One post from a neighbor named Gerald Matthews particularly resonated. Gerald was a retired attorney, and he wrote a detailed breakdown of how Sharon had been overstepping her authority in multiple ways, including making unilateral decisions that should have required full board votes and spending HOA funds without proper approval. His post went into specifics about various Minnesota laws governing HOA operations and suggested that Sharon might actually be exposing the HOA to liability. Sharon responded by having Gerald's post removed and threatening to sue him for defamation. This backfired spectacularly. Gerald posted screenshots of Sharon's threat along with a legal analysis of why her actions were themselves potentially defamatory. The neighborhood group exploded with activity, and by the end of that day, we had our 25 signatures. Nina submitted the recall petition on February 23rd. Under the HOA bylaws, this triggered a mandatory special meeting to be held within 30 days where homeowners would vote on whether to remove Sharon from the board. Sharon's response was to schedule the meeting for the maximum allowable time, 30 days exactly, on March 25th, at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday when most people would be at work. "She is trying to stack the deck," Nina said. "She knows her supporters are mostly retirees who can make a weekday afternoon meeting." "Can we challenge the timing?" I asked. Gerald, who had become an unofficial advisor for our cause, shook his head when we met with him at a coffee shop downtown. The bylaws give the board discretion on scheduling, but here is what we can do. We organize an absentee ballot system. The bylaws allow for proxy voting if the homeowner submits written authorization. So we get people to designate proxies to vote on their behalf, Nina said. Exactly. And we make sure those proxies are people who will actually show up to the meeting. We spent the next 3 weeks organizing. Nina created a simple proxy form and circulated it through the neighborhood. I kept up my Parka protests, which had become less about the heater and more about symbolizing resistance to Sharon's authoritarianism. We held informal gatherings at our house where neighbors could voice their frustrations and learn about the recall process. My code enforcement hearing happened on March 15th, right in the middle of all this. I showed up with 2 binders full of documentation, and my lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca Torres who specialized in business licensing issues. The hearing officer, a tired-looking city employee named Martin something, reviewed the complaint and my evidence. "Mr. Quinlan," he said, "based on what I am seeing here, you have a properly licensed business operating out of a legitimate commercial space. The complaint alleges you are running electrical contracting operations from your residence. Do you have any business signage at your home? No. Do you meet clients at your home? No. All client meetings happen at my office or at job sites. Do you store significant amounts of commercial inventory at your home? Just some personal tools and basic supplies in my garage. Nothing commercial scale." Martin looked at the complaint form again, then at Rebecca. "This appears to be a nuisance complaint without merit," he said. "I am dismissing it. Mr. Quinlan, you are free to go. If you determine who filed this complaint and believe it was done maliciously, you may have grounds for a civil claim." Rebecca smiled. "Thank you, sir. We will consider our options." Outside the building, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. That was easier than I expected. "The complaint was always garbage," Rebecca said. "The question is whether you want to pursue action against whoever filed it." "I know who filed it," I said. "But I want to wait until after the recall vote. No need to give Sharon ammunition by looking vindictive." The code enforcement victory gave our campaign a boost. When word spread through the neighborhood that Sharon had apparently filed a false complaint against me, several people who had been on the fence signed up to vote for recall. March 25th arrived with an unusual warmth. The temperature had climbed to 50 degrees, the highest it had been in months, and there was a sense that winter might finally be loosening its grip on Minnesota. I still wore my parka to get the mail that morning because I was committed to the bit, but I was sweating by the time I got back to the house. The special meeting was held at the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that usually hosted book clubs and birthday parties. Nina and I arrived at 1:30 to help set up chairs and greet people as they arrived. By 1:45, the parking lot was already full, with people parking along the street. It seemed like everyone in the neighborhood wanted to be part of this. Sharon arrived exactly at 2, flanked by the other 2 board members, Patricia and the tired-looking man whose name I had learned was Donald. She surveyed the packed room with visible surprise and displeasure. Gerald, who we had asked to moderate the meeting since he was neutral and had legal experience, called things to order at 2:05. "This special meeting has been called in accordance with Section 12, Subsection 4 of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA bylaws," he began. "We are here to vote on a petition to recall Sharon Whitmore from her position as board president. Per the bylaws, a recall requires a 2/3 majority vote of homeowners present or represented by proxy." Sharon stood up. "Before we begin, I want to challenge the validity of several proxy votes. I believe some signatures were obtained under false pretenses. On what basis? Gerald asked. I have reason to believe that Isaac Quinlan and his wife misrepresented the nature of this recall, leading people to sign proxy forms without understanding what they were agreeing to. A murmur ran through the crowd. Nina stood up, her face flushed. That is completely false, she said. Every person who signed a proxy form was given a written explanation of exactly what they were signing. We have copies of everything. I would like to see those copies, Sharon said. Gerald intervened. Unless you have specific evidence of fraud, Mrs. Whitmore, we will proceed with the vote as planned. Do you have such evidence? Sharon's jaw clenched. Not at this time, but I reserve the right to challenge the results if irregularities are discovered. Noted. Now, before we vote, both sides will have the opportunity to make their case. Mrs. Whitmore, as the subject of the recall, you may speak first. Sharon stood and walked to the front of the room. She had clearly prepared remarks. I understand that some people in this neighborhood are unhappy with the way I have enforced our community rules, she began. But these rules exist to protect all of us. They preserve our property values, maintain the character of our neighborhood, and ensure that everyone contributes to our collective well-being. Yes, I have had to issue violations and fines. That is part of my job as board president. It is not personal, and it is not about power. It is about maintaining standards. She went on for several more minutes, painting herself as a dutiful public servant who was being unfairly targeted for doing a thankless job. Some of her supporters nodded along when she finished. Gerald invited me to speak on behalf of the recall petition. I stood up, my heart pounding. Public speaking was not my strong suit, but this mattered too much to back down. I moved to Meadowbrook Hills 7 months ago, I began. My wife and I chose this neighborhood because it seemed like a great place to build a life, and in many ways it is. We have wonderful neighbors. The location is perfect. The homes are beautiful. But living under this HOA board, specifically under Sharon's leadership, has been a nightmare of petty enforcement and arbitrary rule interpretation. I walked through the examples. The grass height violation when my grass was measured at 1 3/4 inches when the rule said no more than 2 inches. The garbage can violation when I brought my cans in at 8 in the morning instead of 6. The work truck violation even though other neighbors kept trucks, RVs, and boats in their driveways without issue. But the heater situation was what made me realize this was not just about following rules, I continued. I built a shelter at the Mailbox cluster with proper approval. I installed a heater so people would not freeze while getting their mail. Sharon called it a safety hazard and threatened me with fines, so I started wearing this ridiculous parka instead. I gestured to the parka I had brought with me as a prop. A few people laughed. And Sharon's response was to escalate further. She tried to remove my shelter before the grace period was up. She filed what appears to be a false complaint with code enforcement against my business. She has threatened liens, lawsuits, and made my life stressful over things that do not matter. This is not about maintaining property values. This is about someone who enjoys having power over other people. I sat down to solid applause. Gerald then opened the floor for comments from other homeowners. What followed was over an hour of neighbors sharing their experiences with Sharon's board. The Johnsons talked about being bullied out of their solar panel plans. The Chens described the Red Door saga. A widow named Martha Reynolds broke down crying as she described how Sharon had fined her for weeds in her garden beds, while Martha was in the hospital recovering from surgery. By the time the comment period ended, Sharon's face was hard as stone. Several of her supporters had visibly shifted in their seats, looking uncomfortable. Gerald finally called for the vote. Homeowners were given colored cards, green for keeping Sharon on the board, red for recall. Proxy votes would be counted separately but carried equal weight. The counting took 20 minutes. Gerald, along with 2 volunteer witnesses, tallied everything twice to be sure. Finally, Gerald stood at the front of the room with the results. Total eligible voters, 82. Homeowners present, 47. Proxy votes, 28. Total votes cast, 75. He paused, looking at Sharon. Votes in favor of recall, 53. Votes against recall, 22. With 70.6% voting in favor, the 2/3 threshold has been met. Sharon Whitmore is hereby removed from the HOA board effective immediately. The room erupted in applause. Sharon stood frozen for a moment, then grabbed her purse and walked out without a word, slamming the door behind her. But the meeting was not over. The bylaws required that a recalled board member be replaced immediately, either by appointment or election depending on timing. Since this was a special meeting, Gerald explained that the remaining board members could appoint a replacement subject to confirmation at the next regular meeting, or the homeowners present could elect someone right now. "I move that we elect a replacement tonight," someone called out. "I second," said another voice. Donald, the tired-looking board member, raised his hand. "I nominate Brenda Patterson to return to the board if she is willing." Brenda, who was sitting near the back, looked surprised but nodded. "I would be honored." There were no other nominations. Brenda was elected unanimously. As the meeting broke up, neighbors came over to shake my hand and thank Nina and me for organizing the recall. Gerald pulled me aside. "You should know," he said quietly. "Sharon could potentially sue the HOA or individual homeowners over this recall. She strikes me as the litigious type. On what grounds? She would probably claim defamation or improper procedure. She would not win, but she could make things expensive and annoying." "Let her try," I said. "We have documentation of everything." Gerald smiled. "Good. Also, about that code enforcement complaint. If you want to pursue a malicious reporting claim, I would be happy to help with that. Pro bono." I thought about it. "Give me a few weeks to think about it. Right now, I just want to enjoy this win." The next morning, I went to the mailbox without the parka for the first time in 2 months. It was 55 degrees and sunny, almost warm enough to call it spring. I had already plugged the heater back in, though we would not need it much longer given the changing weather. Several neighbors waved as I walked past. The Chens, who I had not talked to much before, came out to congratulate me on the recall. Martha Reynolds brought over a plate of cookies as a thank you. It felt like the neighborhood had collectively exhaled, releasing tension we had all been carrying. 2 days later, I received a letter from Sharon's attorney. Just as Gerald had predicted, she was threatening to sue for defamation based on my comments at the meeting. The letter demanded a public apology and retraction within 10 days, or face legal action. I forwarded the letter to Rebecca Torres, my business lawyer, who had become familiar with the HOA situation. She called me within an hour. "This is a slap suit threat," she said. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. She is trying to intimidate you into silence." The good news is Minnesota has pretty strong anti-slap statutes. If she actually files, we can get it dismissed quickly and potentially recover attorney fees. So I should ignore this, not ignore. Respond through me. Make it clear you stand by your statements as they were truthful and made in a proper forum, and let her know we will pursue sanctions if she files a frivolous suit. Rebecca sent the response letter, and I waited to see what would happen next. What happened was that Sharon apparently decided to go even bigger. In mid-April, I received notice that Sharon had filed a complaint with the Minnesota Office of the Attorney General, claiming that the recall election was conducted improperly, and asking the state to investigate the HOA for various violations of state law. She claimed that Gerald had conflicts of interest, that proxy votes were obtained fraudulently, and that the HOA was not following its own bylaws in multiple ways. This was more serious. While Sharon's defamation threat was empty, a state investigation could cause real problems for the HOA and potentially overturn the recall. Brenda, now back on the board, called an emergency meeting of the homeowners to discuss the situation. Gerald explained that the Attorney General's office did have authority to investigate HOAs under certain circumstances, and while Sharon's complaint was likely baseless, we needed to take it seriously. "The best defense is a good offense," Gerald said. "We should file our own complaint about Sharon's conduct while she was board president. Document all the selective enforcement, the improper spending, the retaliatory actions. Make it clear that her complaint is motivated by personal vendetta rather than legitimate concern." Over the next 2 weeks, a group of us compiled a comprehensive report of Sharon's time as board president. We documented 17 instances of selective enforcement where rules were applied to some homeowners but not others, 4 cases of potential financial impropriety, including spending HOA funds without proper board votes, 8 instances of retaliatory conduct, including the code enforcement complaint against me, multiple violations of proper meeting procedures, including decisions made without quorum and insufficient notice for board meetings. We submitted this report to the Attorney General's office along with a formal response to Sharon's complaint. Then we waited. The answer came in late May. The Attorney General's office sent letters to both Sharon and the HOA. Sharon's complaint had been reviewed and determined to have no merit. The recall election was conducted properly, and while there were some procedural irregularities during Sharon's tenure, they did not rise to the level requiring state intervention. However, the letter to the HOA included a warning that the board needed to tighten up its procedures and ensure proper documentation going forward. Sharon's letter apparently included some stronger language about filing frivolous complaints, though we only heard about that secondhand. With the state investigation resolved in our favor, I thought the drama might finally be over. The weather had turned warm, I had put away the parka, and the neighborhood felt peaceful again. But Sharon had one more card to play. In early June, I came home from work to find 2 police cars parked in front of my house. My stomach dropped as I pulled into the driveway. A police officer approached as I got out of my truck. "Isaac Quinlan?" he asked. "Yes. I am Officer Davis with Duluth PD. We received a report that you have been threatening and harassing a neighbor. Do you have a moment to talk?" My blood went cold. Of course. What neighbor? Sharon Whitmore. Of course it was. Officer Davis explained that Sharon had filed a report claiming I had been following her car around the neighborhood, sending her threatening messages, and trespassing on her property. She had provided what she claimed were screenshots of messages and photos of my truck near her house. "Officer, none of that is true," I said. "Sharon and I had a conflict over HOA issues. It was resolved through proper channels. I have not contacted her or gone near her property." "Can you prove that?" "I can prove I have not sent her any messages." I can also explain why she might be making false accusations. I invited Officer Davis inside and spent the next hour walking him through the entire HOA saga. I showed him documentation of everything: the heater dispute, the recall election, Sharon's complaints to various agencies, the threatening letters from her attorney, everything. Nina came home in the middle of this and added her perspective. Officer Davis listened carefully, taking notes. "These screenshots Mrs. Whitmore provided," he said finally. "They show messages from a phone number she says is yours. Is this your number?" He showed me a printout. The number was not mine, not even close. "That is not my number," I said. "Here, look." I showed him my phone, my number clearly displayed in the settings. Officer Davis compared the numbers and nodded. "They are not the same. What about this photo she says shows your truck near her house?" He showed me a grainy photo of a white pickup truck. My truck was white, but so were thousands of others in Duluth. "Can I see the photo more closely?" Nina asked. Officer Davis handed her the printout. She studied it for a moment, then pulled out her phone. "That is not Isaac's truck. Look at the bed. Isaac's truck has a ladder rack and a toolbox. This truck is empty. Also, Isaac's truck has his company logo on the door. This one does not." Officer Davis examined the photo again. "You are right. Mrs. Whitmore claimed this was definitely your vehicle, but the details do not match." A second officer who had been waiting outside was called in, and they conferred quietly. "Mr. Quinlan," Officer Davis said, "based on what you have shown me and the inconsistencies in Mrs. Whitmore's report, I do not believe you have committed any crime. However, I do believe Mrs. Whitmore may have filed a false police report, which is a misdemeanor in Minnesota. Would you be willing to provide us with copies of your documentation so we can investigate further?" "Would I?" "Absolutely." I spent another hour making copies of everything relevant and providing the officers with contact information for witnesses who could corroborate my version of events, including Gerald, Brenda, and several neighbors. The officers thanked us and left. Nina and I sat in the living room, stunned. "She filed a false police report," Nina said. "That is actually criminal. I know. This is completely insane. I know." We sat in silence for a moment, processing everything. "Isaac," Nina said finally, "I think she is having some kind of breakdown. This has gone way past HOA petness. She is committing crimes now." I thought about Martha Reynolds crying at the recall meeting. I thought about all the neighbors who had been too afraid to stand up to Sharon's bullying. I thought about how Sharon had escalated every single step of this conflict, unable to accept that she might be wrong. "You might be right," I said, "but that does not make her less dangerous. If anything, it makes her more unpredictable." The police investigation moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, Officer Davis called to inform me that they had determined Sharon's report was indeed false. The phone number in the screenshots belonged to no one. It was a fake number. The photo of the truck was a stock photo she had downloaded from the internet. The trespassing claims could not be substantiated, and in fact, her own security camera footage showed no one approaching her property during the time she claimed I was there. "We will be charging Mrs. Whitmore with filing a false police report," Officer Davis said. "I wanted to give you a heads up in case she retaliates further. If she contacts you or comes near your property, call us immediately." Sharon was arrested on June 23rd. The arrest was quiet and professional, no drama, but word spread through the neighborhood almost immediately. The Facebook group exploded with reactions ranging from shock to, "I knew she would go too far eventually." Sharon pleaded not guilty and hired a criminal defense attorney. The case was scheduled for trial in September, but in late August, her attorney negotiated a plea deal. Sharon pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of providing false information to law enforcement, a misdemeanor. She was sentenced to 6 months probation, a $1,000 fine, and mandatory counseling. Additionally, as part of the plea agreement, Sharon agreed to a restraining order preventing her from contacting me, Nina, or several other neighbors for 2 years. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that Sharon and her husband quietly put their house on the market in September and moved out of Meadowbrook Hills in October. I never saw her again after the arrest. The HOA, under new leadership with Brenda as president, underwent significant reforms. The board implemented clearer procedures for enforcement, established an appeal process for violations, and created a rule that fines could only be issued after a warning period, except in cases of genuine safety hazards. They also repealed or modified several of the more absurd rules Sharon had championed. My mailbox shelter, complete with its electric outlet and space for a heater when needed, became an official HOA amenity. In fact, the board approved 2 more shelters at other mailbox clusters around the neighborhood, built to my specifications. The Parka, which had become something of a neighborhood legend, was retired to my closet. Although on particularly cold days, I would occasionally pull it out just for fun, and my neighbors would laugh and wave. Nina and I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in July to celebrate everything settling down. Nearly 40 households showed up, including Gerald and Brenda, and many of the people who had supported the recall. It was the kind of community gathering that should have been normal all along, neighbors enjoying each other's company without fear of petty rule enforcement. As I stood in my backyard, watching Nina laugh with the Chens while their kids played with our dogs, I felt grateful for how everything had turned out. What started as a dispute over a portable heater had exposed deep problems in our community and ultimately led to positive change. Did I regret any of it? Maybe wearing the parka on that 50-degree day in March when I genuinely thought I might pass out from heat exhaustion. But otherwise, no. Sometimes standing up to petty tyrants is worth the hassle, even when it becomes way more complicated than you expected. Sometimes you just have to put on your parka, literally or metaphorically, and refuse to back down. The following spring, I was elected to the HOA board myself. It was not something I had planned, but when several neighbors approached me about running, I figured why not. I knew firsthand what bad HOA leadership looked like, and I wanted to help ensure we never went back to that. Our first major initiative was to revise the HOA bylaws to include more homeowner protections and limit the board's ability to act unilaterally. Gerald helped draft the changes, which were overwhelmingly approved at the annual meeting. We also established a community fund for common improvements, and the first project funded was a full weather shelter at the main mailbox cluster, bigger and nicer than my original structure, with proper lighting, benches, and yes, an electric heater for the winter months. I attended the dedication ceremony for the new shelter in May. Brenda gave a short speech about community cooperation and how conflict, when handled properly, can lead to positive change. Then, she unveiled a small plaque that had been mounted on the shelter wall. It read, "Meadowbrook Hills Community Mail Shelter, dedicated to all residents who brave Minnesota winters, inspired by Isaac Quinlan and his orange parka." Everyone laughed and applauded. I felt my face turn red, but I was smiling. That evening, Nina and I sat on our back deck, watching the sunset and enjoying the warm spring weather. "You know what I realized," Nina said. "We never did use that heater very much. By the time everything was resolved, winter was basically over." "I used it," I protested, "like 3 times." 3 times. All this drama over 3 times using a heater, I laughed. It was never really about the heater. "No," Nina agreed. "It was about being able to check your mail without freezing, and about standing up to someone who abused their authority, and about building the kind of community we want to live in. When you put it that way, it sounds almost profound." "Almost." She grinned and clinked her glass against mine. "To portable heaters and orange parkas. To portable heaters and orange parkas, I repeated. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky fade from orange to pink to purple. Somewhere down the street, kids were playing basketball. A few houses over, someone was grilling dinner. It was peaceful and normal and exactly what a neighborhood should be. My phone buzzed with a message from Gerald. Board meeting next Tuesday at 7. Agenda includes discussion of pool maintenance contract and review of landscaping bids. Please review attached documents before meeting. Professional, organized, boring in the best possible way. Exactly how HOA business should be conducted. I responded confirming my attendance, then put the phone away and went back to enjoying the evening. The orange parka still hung in my closet, waiting for next winter. I hoped I would not need to make any more dramatic protests, but if I did, I was ready. Sometimes standing up for what is right requires you to look a little ridiculous, and that was okay, because at the end of the day it worked. The tyrant was gone, the community was stronger, and I could check my mail in reasonable comfort regardless of the weather. It was not the ending I expected when I first plugged in that portable heater back in January, but it was a good ending nonetheless. And really, what more could you ask for from an HOA story? As fall approached and the weather started to cool again, I found myself at the Mailbox cluster on a crisp October evening. The new shelter was working perfectly, protecting several neighbors from a light rain as we collected our mail and chatted about weekend plans. The heater was not running yet. It was only 45 degrees, but it was there, ready for when we needed it. A small victory, perhaps, but a real one. I waved goodbye to my neighbors and walked home through the quiet streets of Meadowbrook Hills, past houses decorated with autumn wreaths and Halloween decorations. Some had cars in the driveways that were technically violations under the old interpretation of the rules. Others had gardens that were probably not perfectly to code. Nobody cared. We had finally found the balance between maintaining standards and allowing people to actually live their lives. When I got home, Nina was making dinner while video calling her sister. Our dogs greeted me enthusiastically as they always did. Normal domestic life, beautifully mundane. How was male duty? Nina asked after she hung up. Uneventful, I said. Exactly how it should be. She smiled, understanding what I meant. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard the first weather forecast predicting snow for the following week. Winter was coming again, as it always did in Minnesota. But this time, I would not need the parka. The shelter and heater would be enough. Though I might wear it anyway just once, for old time's sake. After all, it had become part of neighborhood lore. Why waste a good running gag? But that would be my choice, not something forced on me by unreasonable rules enforced by petty tyrants. And that difference, that freedom to make reasonable choices about my own life, made all the struggle worthwhile. I climbed into bed next to Nina, who was already reading a book. "You are smiling," she observed. "Just thinking about everything that happened this year." The heater, the parka, Sharon, all of it. Any regrets? I considered the question seriously. No, it was exhausting and stressful, but we made things better. For us and for everyone else in the neighborhood, that matters. Yes, Nina agreed, setting down her book. It does. The next morning, I saw Sharon's old house as I drove past on my way to work. A young family had moved in, their moving truck still parked in the driveway. Two small kids were running around the front yard while their parents directed the movers. They looked happy, excited about their new home. I wondered if they knew the neighborhood's recent history. Probably not yet. Maybe they would hear stories eventually, the legend of the orange parka and the HOA president who went too far. Or maybe it would fade into neighborhood mythology, the details getting fuzzy over time. Either way, they were moving into a better community than the one Nina and I had moved into a year ago. A community that had learned some hard lessons about the balance between rules and reason, between authority and respect. I drove on to work, ready to tackle whatever the day brought. There would be new challenges, new problems to solve, new conflicts to navigate. But I had learned something important over the past year. Sometimes the right thing to do is to stand up, even when it is difficult, even when it seems easier to just comply and keep your head down. Sometimes you have to plug in the heater, put on the parka and fight for common sense and human decency. And sometimes, if you are lucky and persistent and you have a community that ultimately shares your values, you win. Not every story has a happy ending, but this one did. The heater stayed, the rules got better, and the tyrant faced consequences for her actions. Justice was served, the community was strengthened, and winter became just a little more bearable for everyone in Meadowbrook Hills. As far as HOA stories go, I would call that a complete success. And if next winter I show up at the mailbox wearing that ridiculous orange parka on a perfectly mild day, just to make my neighbors laugh and remember what we all went through together, well, that is my right as a homeowner in a free country. A right I would never take for granted again.